Have you ever been betrayed by someone who shared your childhood, your memories, and your last name? Stay with me until the end, because this story begins with a stolen inheritance and ends with a secret my father carried to his grave. The first time I realized my brother had stolen from me, I was standing beside our father's coffin. Rain tapped softly against the cemetery tents. Relatives spoke in hushed voices. Flowers surrounded the grave. And all I could think about was the empty chair where my father used to sit every Sunday afternoon. My name is Nkosana Mbakila. I was 32 years old and worked as a survey engineer in Kebra. My father, Bekumuzi Mbakila, was not a wealthy man by newspaper standards. He never owned private jets. He never appeared on television. But he spent 40 years building a transportation company from nothing. Every long night, every missed holiday, every sacrifice, he did it believing one day his children would stand together. Instead, his death tore our family apart. 3 days after the funeral, my older brother Vuyo called a family meeting. He arrived wearing an expensive suit and the confidence of someone who already believed he had one. By the time that meeting ended, I would lose everything my father intended to leave me. Or so my brother thought, because while Vuyo was busy stealing my inheritance, he had no idea Dad left me something far more valuable, something that would change everything. 3 days after my father's funeral, our family gathered inside a quiet conference room for the reading of his estate. The atmosphere felt heavy. Everyone was still grieving. My father's absence filled every corner of the room. I sat there expecting a difficult day but not a shocking one. No matter what happened, I believed my father would divide everything fairly between his 2 sons. That was the kind of man he had always been. The attorney opened the file and began reading. At first everything seemed normal. Then suddenly the room became silent. A revised version of my father's will had appeared. As the attorney continued reading, my heart started pounding harder with every word. The transportation company that my father had spent 40 years building was being left to my brother Vuyo. The family home where we grew up was also going to Vuyo. The investment accounts, savings, and even valuable collections that carried deep family memories had all been assigned to him as well. I sat frozen in my chair, struggling to understand what I was hearing. Surely there had to be some mistake. This couldn't be what my father wanted. Around the room, I noticed confused expressions on the faces of my relatives. Some exchanged nervous glances. Others quietly whispered among themselves. Nobody seemed to understand how one son could receive almost everything while the other received almost nothing. But while everyone else looked surprised, Vuyo looked completely different. He wasn't shocked. He wasn't confused. In fact, he seemed calm and comfortable, almost confident. It was as if he already knew exactly what was written in that document before the meeting even started. Every time another major asset was mentioned, he simply nodded slightly and remained silent. That was the moment something inside me began to change. My sadness slowly turned into suspicion. The more I watched my brother, the more uncomfortable I became. This didn't feel like a normal inheritance reading. It felt like a performance where only one person already knew the ending. When the meeting finally ended, relatives approached me with sympathy in their eyes, but their words barely registered. My mind was racing. I walked out of the building feeling devastated, betrayed, and completely lost. My father had always valued fairness, honesty, and family above everything else. Yet the document I had just heard told a very different story as I stood outside staring at the cloudy sky. One thought refused to leave my mind. Something wasn't right. And deep down, I knew this was only the beginning. After the shocking reading of my father's will, I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. The more I replayed that meeting in my mind, the more old memories started returning. Memories I had ignored for years. Memories that suddenly seemed connected to everything happening now. Growing up, my brother Vuyo always wanted to be the center of attention. He loved being praised. He loved being admired. If someone else received recognition, he would find a way to bring the focus back to himself. Even as children, he wanted people to see him as the most important person in every room. My father noticed it too. Many times he tried to teach us both the same lessons. He believed that character mattered more than appearances. He always said that respect should be earned through actions, not demanded through status. He taught us to work hard, stay humble, and never allow money to define who we were. But as we grew older, Vuyo seemed to move further away from those values. While most people our age were saving money and building stable careers, Vuyo became obsessed with looking successful. He bought expensive cars he could barely afford. He took luxury vacations and constantly posted pictures showing a perfect life. He entered risky business deals that promised quick profits. Everywhere he went, he wanted people to believe he was wealthy, powerful, and important. I chose a different path. I wasn't interested in impressing anyone. I focused on my work as a survey engineer. I paid my bills. I lived within my means. My life wasn't glamorous, but it was honest. My father often told me that consistency would take me further than chasing attention ever could. As the days passed after the inheritance reading, something unexpected began happening. Family members started contacting me privately. One aunt called late one evening. A cousin visited me after work. Even some of my father's old friends reached out. Every conversation sounded almost the same. Your father would never do this. He loved both of his sons. Something about this doesn't make sense. Not a single person believed my father would leave nearly everything to one child. The more people spoke, the stranger the situation became. Some relatives admitted they had been shocked by Vuyo's behavior at the reading. Others mentioned how unusually confident he seemed before the meeting even started. A few even wondered if he already knew what the will contained. With every conversation, my doubts grew stronger. What had first felt like a painful family disappointment was beginning to feel like something much bigger. And for the first time, I started asking myself a question I never thought I would have to ask. Had my brother planned this long before our father died? The more I thought about the will, the more questions I had. Nothing about the situation felt normal. My father had spent his entire life teaching fairness, responsibility, and family unity. Yet somehow, a document appeared that gave almost everything to Vuyo and left me with almost nothing. I couldn't accept it without looking deeper. I decided to start with the attorney who supposedly handled the revised will. If anyone knew the truth, it would be him. I called his office expecting simple answers. Instead, I ran into another mystery. The attorney had retired unexpectedly several months before my father's death. No public announcement. No clear explanation. Just gone. First, I thought it was a coincidence. But when I tried contacting him through old phone numbers and email addresses, nobody responded. Days passed with no answers. Every door I knocked on seemed to remain closed. That only made me more determined. I started requesting copies of records connected to the revised will. But the deeper I looked, the stranger things became. Some files appeared incomplete. Important dates were missing. Certain documents that should have existed could not be located. The entire process felt unusually messy for something as important as a person's final wishes. One evening, just as I was beginning to feel stuck, my phone rang. The caller ID showed an unfamiliar number. I almost ignored it. Almost. When I answered, a woman introduced herself as a former legal assistant who had worked with the retired attorney years earlier. Her voice sounded nervous. She told me she had been following news about my father's estate and felt uncomfortable staying silent any longer. Then she shared something that made my stomach drop. A few months before my father's death, she remembered several private meetings connected to estate documents. First, she didn't think much about them. But after hearing about the inheritance dispute, the memories started bothering her. The strange part wasn't that meetings had happened. The strange part was who attended them. According to her, Vuyo had been present multiple times. But my father wasn't. I sat there speechless. My father was known for handling important business matters personally. He never trusted others to make major decisions for him. The idea that meetings about his estate could happen without him present made no sense. The assistant admitted she couldn't prove wrongdoing, but she clearly remembered feeling uncomfortable about the situation even then. After the call ended, I stared at the wall for a long time. For weeks, I had only suspicion. Now I had something more dangerous. A clue. For the first time since the funeral, the pieces were beginning to move in a direction I couldn't ignore. And that direction pointed straight at my brother. What if the will wasn't changed by accident? What if someone had carefully planned everything from the very beginning? A few days after speaking with the former legal assistant, I decided to spend more time at my father's company headquarters. The building felt different without him. For over 40 years, he had walked those halls every morning. Employees respected him. Customers trusted him. That company wasn't just a business. It was his life's work. I started helping organize old files and documents that had been left untouched since his funeral. Most of it was routine paperwork, financial statements, contracts, employee records. Nothing that explained the mystery surrounding the inheritance. Then I noticed something unusual. At the end of a quiet hallway was my father's private office. The door was locked at first. I assumed someone had already gone through it after his death. But when I asked a long-time employee, he shook his head. No one has entered that office since the day your father passed away. My heart started racing. After finding a spare key among company records, I slowly unlocked the door. The room looked exactly as my father had left it. His chair remained behind the desk. Family photographs sat neatly on a shelf. His reading glasses rested beside a stack of papers. For a moment, it felt as if he might walk back into the room at any second. I spent hours carefully sorting through everything inside. There were journals, personal correspondence, financial reports, handwritten notes, and folders filled with records dating back years. Then I found something that immediately caught my attention. One notebook contained repeated entries about Vuyo. Page after page described concerns about his spending habits. My father had documented expensive purchases, risky investments, and growing financial problems. Some entries showed frustration. Others showed worry. He wasn't angry. He was concerned. The deeper I read, the more alarming the notes became. According to my father's records, Vuyo had been accumulating debt for years. Far more debt than anyone in the family knew about. Then I discovered another journal. This one contained something even more shocking. Several entries mentioned my father's fear that someone close to him was trying to influence important estate decisions. He never wrote a name, but he repeatedly described feeling pressured. He wrote about conversations that left him uneasy. He even noted that certain people seemed unusually interested in his assets and inheritance plans. As I sat alone in that office reading his words, a chill ran through me. My father had seen warning signs long before the rest of us. While everyone believed everything was fine, he had quietly documented his concerns. He knew something was wrong. He knew someone might try to take advantage of him. The question that haunted me wasn't whether my father suspected trouble. The question was whether he had found a way to protect his legacy before it was too late. Because the more I uncovered, the more it felt like my father had been preparing for something he never lived long enough to explain. After discovering my father's journals, I knew I couldn't stop digging. The notes about Vuyo's spending habits kept replaying in my mind. My father had clearly been worried about something, and I needed to know how serious the situation really was. What I found over the next few weeks completely changed how I viewed everything. At first, Vuyo's life looked impressive from the outside. He drove expensive cars, stayed in luxury hotels, wore designer clothes, and constantly talked about new business opportunities. To most people, he looked successful, confident, wealthy. But appearances can be dangerous. The deeper I investigated, the more I realized that much of Vuyo's lifestyle had been built on borrowed money. Several of his investments had failed badly. Businesses he claimed were thriving had actually been losing money for years. Properties he bragged about owning were heavily financed. Behind the expensive suits and confident smile was a financial disaster that nobody in the family knew about. As records began surfacing, the truth became impossible to ignore. Vuyo wasn't simply struggling. He was drowning. Debt notices had been arriving months before our father died. Loan payments had fallen behind. Financial obligations were piling up faster than he could handle them. In some cases, creditors had already started demanding immediate payment. I sat at my kitchen table one night surrounded by documents, trying to process everything. Suddenly, the inheritance no longer looked like a family disagreement. It looked like a lifeline. Everything started making sense. The transportation company wasn't just valuable to Vuyo because it belonged to our father. It represented security. The family home wasn't simply a sentimental property. It was an asset that could be borrowed against or sold. The investment accounts weren't a bonus. They were a rescue plan. For the first time, I understood something important. Vuyo didn't simply want the inheritance. He needed it. Without access to those assets, the carefully built image he had spent years creating would collapse almost overnight. His reputation, his lifestyle, his business connections. Everything depended on people believing he was successful. And the moment that illusion disappeared, the entire structure would come crashing down. As painful as it was, I even began feeling a small amount of sympathy. Imagine carrying that much pressure. Imagine living every day knowing disaster was getting closer. But sympathy didn't erase responsibility, because another realization was beginning to take shape. Desperation changes people. When someone feels trapped, they start making choices they would never make under normal circumstances. Some people ask for help, some people admit the truth, and some people do whatever it takes to survive. As I looked at the evidence spread across my table, a chilling thought entered my mind. What if my brother hadn't fought for the inheritance because he was greedy? What if he fought for it because he believed it was the only thing standing between him and complete ruin? A few days after uncovering the truth about Vuyo's financial problems, I returned to my father's company headquarters once again. By then I had spent countless hours searching through old files, storage cabinets, and archive boxes. Most of what I found helped me understand the past, but none of it explained why my father seemed so prepared for the trouble that followed his death. That afternoon, I was sorting through a forgotten section of company archives in a small storage room at the back of the building. Dust covered almost everything. Many of the boxes had not been opened in years. I nearly missed it. Tucked between old financial reports and company records was a sealed envelope. First it looked ordinary. Then I saw my name. Nkosana. My heart immediately skipped a beat. The handwriting on the front was unmistakable. It belonged to my father. For a moment I simply stared at it. My hands actually trembled as I picked it up. The envelope looked old, as if it had been waiting there for a very long time. Almost as though my father had hidden it knowing one day I would come looking for answers. I carefully broke the seal and unfolded the letter inside. The moment I saw his handwriting across the page, emotions hit me harder than I expected. It felt like hearing his voice again after weeks of silence. The first lines made my chest tighten. My father wrote that if I was reading the letter, then events had likely unfolded exactly as he feared they would. I stopped reading for a second. The room suddenly felt smaller. He knew. Long before his death, he had seen the warning signs. He had suspected that conflict would follow. He had worried that certain people might make choices driven by greed, fear, or desperation. As I continued reading, my father's words became even more personal. He explained that true character is revealed when money enters a family. He wrote that wealth often exposes who people really are. Then came the sentence that changed everything. He explained that the inheritance everyone knew about was never the most valuable thing he intended to leave behind. I read the line twice to make sure I understood it correctly. The company, the house, the investment accounts. According to him, those assets were only part of the story. There was something else, something hidden, something he had spent years protecting. And according to the letter, only I was supposed to find it. My pulse raced as I continued reading. Every answer seemed to create a new question. What had he hidden? Why had he hidden it? And why had he trusted only me to discover it? For the first time since the funeral, I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks. Hope. Because while everyone else was fighting over what they believed my father left behind, I was beginning to realize that his greatest gift had never been included in the will at all. And somewhere beyond those pages, a secret was waiting to be uncovered. After finding my father's letter, I barely slept that night. His words kept repeating in my mind. He had written that the inheritance everyone knew about was not the most valuable thing he planned to leave behind. Somewhere, hidden from public view, was something far more important. The next morning, I began following every clue mentioned in the letter. Some clues pointed toward old company records. Others referenced business agreements and account numbers that meant nothing to me at first. It felt like my father had created a trail only I was supposed to follow. For days I searched through documents, contracts, and files. Then slowly, the truth began to reveal itself. My father had spent decades building more than just the transportation company everyone knew about. Hidden behind layers of legal agreements was an entire network of business holdings, small investments, property partnerships, private shares, long-term business interests. Individually, they seemed ordinary. Together, they formed something extraordinary. I sat in disbelief as I realized what I was looking at. While everyone had been focused on the public estate, my father had quietly built a second foundation over many years, one that very few people knew existed. What shocked me even more was how carefully everything had been arranged. Every document had been prepared legally. Every agreement had been properly recorded. Every ownership transfer had been planned years in advance. My father hadn't hidden these assets because he wanted secrecy. He had protected them because he understood something important. Not everyone values responsibility the same way. As I continued reading through the documents, I found another personal note from him. His words immediately brought tears to my eyes. He explained that leadership is not about who deserves something because of birth order. It is about who will protect it, who will grow it, who will honor the sacrifices that created it. For the first time, I fully understood his decision. This was never about choosing one son over another. It was about stewardship, trust, responsibility. My father wasn't rewarding me. He was entrusting me. That realization carried a weight far greater than money ever could. For weeks after the funeral, I had felt defeated. I believed I had lost everything. But sitting there surrounded by those documents, I felt something new. Hope. Real hope. The future suddenly looked different. The fear that had followed me since the reading of the will slowly began to disappear. And the most unbelievable part? Vuyo still knew nothing. While he celebrated his apparent victory and fought to hold on to the inheritance, he had no idea that my father had already anticipated everything. He had prepared for betrayal. He had protected his life's work. And he had left behind a plan that was only now coming to light. For the first time since my father's death, I felt as though he was still guiding me. And I knew the story was far from over. In fact, it was only beginning. For months Vuyo had acted as if the battle was already over. After the reading of the will, he carried himself with the confidence of a man who believed he had won everything. He spoke about the future of the company as though it already belonged to him. He attended meetings, made plans, and behaved as if nobody could challenge what had happened. But slowly the cracks began to appear. The legal team reviewing my father's estate started examining the disputed inheritance documents more closely. What had once looked like a simple revision of a will suddenly attracted serious attention. Experts were brought in to review signatures, records, and timelines. The more they examined, the more questions they found. Certain dates did not match. Some documents appeared incomplete. Important records that should have supported the changes were missing. What initially seemed like small irregularities quickly became major concerns. Soon, people who had remained silent for months started speaking. Former employees, business associates, people connected to the legal process. One witness after another came forward with information that painted an increasingly troubling picture. Every new statement added another piece to the puzzle, and every new piece made Vuyo's position weaker. For the first time, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. Fear. The confidence that had once defined him was beginning to disappear. Meanwhile, another crisis was unfolding behind the scenes. The creditors who had been waiting patiently for payment were losing patience. The inheritance Vuyo believed would rescue him was becoming tied up in legal disputes. Assets he expected to control were no longer guaranteed. The money he counted on was slipping further out of reach. Phone calls became more aggressive. Payment demands became more urgent. Deadlines expired. Pressure mounted from every direction. Then the business partners started pulling away. People who once praised Vuyo's ideas suddenly became difficult to reach. Meetings were canceled. Agreements were delayed. Investors began protecting themselves. Nobody wanted to be connected to uncertainty. The image Vuyo had spent years creating was beginning to crumble. His expensive lifestyle no longer looked impressive. It looked reckless. His confidence no longer looked powerful. It looked desperate. Even personal relationships started suffering. Friends became distant. Trusted allies stopped returning calls. The people who had enjoyed standing beside him during good times were nowhere to be found when problems appeared. Watching everything unfold was painful. This was still my brother. Part of me wished things had never reached this point. But another part of me understood something important. The collapse wasn't happening because of bad luck. It was happening because years of hidden choices were finally catching up with him. The fortune he believed would save his future was slipping through his fingers. The story he had carefully built for the world was falling apart. And for the first time, Vuyo was being forced to face a reality he had spent years avoiding. The foundation beneath his entire life had never been as strong as he wanted everyone to believe. And now it was breaking apart for everyone to see. The day of the court hearing finally arrived after months of investigations. arguments, and unanswered questions. As I walked into the courtroom that morning, I felt a mixture of nerves, sadness, and determination. This was never a battle I wanted. I would have given anything to have my father back instead of standing there fighting over what he left behind. The courtroom was crowded. Family members filled the seats. Former employees from my father's company attended. Even people who had known my father for years came to watch. Everyone understood that this case was about more than money. It was about truth. As the proceedings began, lawyers presented evidence collected over the previous months. Financial records were carefully examined. Estate documents were reviewed line by line. Experts explained inconsistencies that had been discovered during their investigations. One by one, witnesses took the stand. Former associates described unusual meetings. Legal professionals discussed missing records. People connected to the estate process shared details that raised even more concerns about how the disputed inheritance documents had been created. With every testimony, the picture became clearer. The confidence Vuyo once carried was gone. For the first time, he looked uncertain. His lawyers tried to defend the documents, but each new piece of evidence seemed to create more questions than answers. Then came the moment that changed everything. My attorney stood and informed the court that we had additional evidence. Evidence that had never been presented before. A quiet murmur spread through the room. Carefully, the letter my father had left for me was introduced into the case, along with supporting documents connected to the hidden ownership structures he had established years earlier. The courtroom became completely silent. As portions of the letter were read, people listened without moving. You could almost feel the tension in the air. My father's words revealed what nobody else had known. He had anticipated conflict. He had worried that greed and desperation might influence decisions after his death. Most importantly, he had taken steps to protect what he spent his lifetime building. Suddenly, every confusing piece of the puzzle fit together. The disputed inheritance that everyone had focused on for months was only part of the story. The hidden business holdings, the private agreements, the carefully planned ownership transfers. Everything connected perfectly. For years, my father had been preparing for possibilities that nobody else saw coming, including betrayal from within his own family. I looked across the courtroom toward Vuyo. The expression on his face was something I will never forget. It wasn't anger. It wasn't frustration. It was realization. For the first time, he understood the truth. The victory he had celebrated after the reading of the will had never been real. While he believed he had secured everything, my father had already seen the danger coming, and he had prepared accordingly. At that moment, the entire courtroom finally understood what my father had known all along. Character always reveals itself in the end. Months after the courtroom revelation, the legal battle finally came to an end. What had started as a painful family dispute became a complete exposure of the truth. The court reviewed all the evidence, examined every document, and reached its final decision. Fraudulent transfers were reversed. Assets that had been improperly claimed were returned to the estate. Ownership records were corrected. The business my father spent his life building was protected exactly as he had intended. For the first time since his funeral, there was clarity. There were no more secrets. No more hidden meetings. No more unanswered questions. The truth had finally won. Vuyo was forced to face the consequences of the choices he had made. The image he spent years protecting had disappeared. The victory he once celebrated had turned into a lesson he could never escape. Looking at him no longer filled me with anger. It filled me with sadness. We had grown up together. We had shared the same home, the same parents, and the same memories. Yet somewhere along the way we chose different paths. But as the legal process ended, I realized something important. The greatest reward was never the money. It was understanding my father one final time. One evening, long after everyone had gone home, I stood alone inside the company headquarters. The building was quiet. The same hallways my father had walked for decades now echoed with silence. I entered his old office and sat at the desk where he had spent countless hours working to create a better future for his family. From a drawer, I removed the letter he had left for me that I had read it many times before. But that evening felt different as the setting sun poured golden light through the office windows. I slowly reread the final lines that my father's message was simple. Success was never measured by money. It was measured by character. Anyone can inherit wealth, but But integrity cannot be passed down through a document. It must be earned through choices, through responsibility, through honesty. At that moment, I finally understood what he had been trying to teach me my entire life. The hidden gift was never just ownership of businesses or assets. It was trust. Why father trusted me to protect what he spent a lifetime building. He trusted me to place principles above profit. He trusted me to do the right thing even when it was difficult. As I looked out across the city skyline, I felt a sense of peace that had been missing since the day of his funeral. My brother had tried to take the inheritance, but he never discovered the one thing that mattered most. Because the greatest thing my father left behind was never written inside a will. It was a final act of faith placed in the son who earned it. And in that moment I knew his legacy would live on exactly as he intended.